The story of Caroline Astor's rise to social supremacy doesn't begin with a title, a family tree, or a fortune. It begins with a house, an address carved into the stone of Fifth Avenue long before the avenue itself understood what it would eventually become. During America's Gilded Age, when industrial wealth surged faster than the etiquette needed to contain it, a residence was far more than a structure. It was a coordinate in an invisible hierarchy, a signal to the city that the people inside belonged to a world where privilege documented itself not through words or deeds, but through walls. To understand Caroline Astor's power, you must imagine New York at a moment when reputations could be made or erased not in public halls or newspapers, but in the quiet orchestration of who passed through a particular doorway on a particular night. At the southwest corner of Fifth Avenue and 34th Street stood a brownstone that, at first glance, appeared modest beside the later palaces of the era. Yet beneath its restrained facade, this house became the central instrument through which Caroline shaped the unwritten laws of American high society. Invitations to her winter gatherings were not mere pieces of cardstock. They were verdicts, silent pronouncements about lineage, manners, alliances, and the delicate equilibrium of old families guarding their space against the tide of new fortunes sweeping into Manhattan. For many, entering her home was not simply a social engagement. It was a lifeline in a world where exclusion could quietly rearrange a family's future. Caroline understood this before anyone else. She saw the Gilded Age not as a time of glitter, but as a battlefield disguised by chandeliers and polished dining tables. Her house was her command post. The drawing rooms were her assembly halls. The dining room was where alliances were strengthened or quietly tested, and the ballroom, small by later standards, was the arena in which she performed her greatest act of influence, the curation of America's social elite. Nothing about the house was accidental. Every proportion, every corridor, every threshold operated like a stage set designed to elevate some visitors while subtly reminding others of their provisional place. The house's power hinged on the fact that only a select few ever saw its interior firsthand. Passing through those doors meant entering a carefully controlled environment where everything, from the arrangement of furniture to the placement of portraits, reinforced the message that this was not simply someone's residence. It was the headquarters of a social order that Caroline herself authored. Yet to grasp how this brownstone operated as such an effective instrument of influence, one must step beyond the symbolic meaning of its address and into the physical structure itself, because the architecture of the house was not a background. It was the mechanism through which its authority worked. And so, to understand how walls became tools, how rooms became filters, and how a building became the center of an entire social universe, we have to move closer, to examine the structure Caroline inhabited, engineered, and ultimately weaponized in her ascent to unchallenged prominence. Caroline Astor's home on 34th Street appeared, at first glance, almost modest compared to the palatial mansions that would later dominate Manhattan, yet its restraint was deliberate, a crafted quietness that signaled confidence rather than limitation. The facade, built of Nova Scotia freestone, carried an elegance that did not shout for attention, but expected it as a matter of course. A double stoop rose toward a pair of Corinthian columns that framed the entrance with calm authority, their carved capitals lifting the eye just enough to suggest classical learning without drifting into theatrical display. Passers-by saw a structure that respected symmetry, proportion, and lineage, a residence that belonged to a family so established it no longer needed architectural noise to affirm its place. Set slightly back from the street, the house was separated from its twin, John Jacob Astor's own residence, by a walled garden. This narrow stretch of greenery created more than a charming interruption in the urban grid. It formed a symbolic boundary, a quiet corridor of privacy, and a reminder that even in the densest part of Manhattan, the Astors could afford space that served no function other than to distance themselves from the ordinary world. A fountain murmured at its center, shielded by trimmed hedges and seasonal plantings that hinted at cultivation rather than indulgence. From the street, only glimpses of the garden were visible, and those glimpses were enough to suggest that the family lived not just beside beauty, but inside it. The windows were arranged with careful precision, framed by understated moldings and crowned with stone architraves that guided the viewer's gaze upward. These details, though subtle, created an impression of balance, of a house built to last, not to impress through novelty. Even the roofline, trimmed with a clean cornice, reinforced the sense that this residence had settled into its address long before the city around it began to rise toward the sky. The mansion was elegant, but never ostentatious. It carried the assurance of a family that believed real power should be felt, not advertised. Anyone approaching the steps experienced a subtle shift in atmosphere. The noise of Fifth Avenue receded behind the stone walls, and the entrance framed visitors in a way that made them feel simultaneously welcomed and assessed. The architecture offered no grand proclamations, but its quiet authority made clear that crossing the threshold was a privilege, not a routine gesture. It was a house that held itself with the composure of a person who has nothing to prove. Yet the true meaning of this structure, the role it played in shaping society, was never fully revealed from the outside. Its facade hinted at dignity, but the real drama, the true purpose of the house, unfolded beyond the doors. Inside, every room, corridor, and ornament would contribute to the carefully orchestrated theater that governed each winter season, turning this brownstone into the beating heart of New York's social world. Stepping inside Caroline Astor's brownstone meant entering a world arranged with the precision of a stage set, where every room played its part in shaping the hierarchy of New York society. The 3 drawing rooms, linked in sequence, were designed not for comfort alone, but for movement, observation, and subtle choreography. Guests passed from one space to the next in a gentle current, allowing Caroline to monitor arrivals, gauge alliances, and make decisions with a glance or a gesture. The first salon greeted visitors with measured elegance, the second gathered them into conversation, and the third delivered them directly into her line of sight, where she stood beneath her life-size portrait by Carolus Duran, a living emblem of the world she controlled. Beyond the suites of drawing rooms, the English Regency dining room offered a different kind of authority. Its transformation each season, from dark wood formality to a shimmering white and gold Louis XVI vision, was not simply decoration, but strategy. The change signaled that the winter season had begun, that expectations had shifted, and that every guest seated at her table was now participating in a ritual that had been refined until it felt almost ceremonial. The meals served there mattered less than the seating arrangements, which Caroline curated as carefully as a chess player, placing pieces for an opening gambit. Proximity to the hostess could alter a family's standing. Distance could quietly cool ambitions. The Adams-style drawing room, with its polished surfaces and gilded ornament, functioned as the social nerve center before each January ball. Here, invitations were rechecked, callers were assessed, and last-minute judgments were made about who had earned a place in the most coveted event of the year. The room's golden glow softened the sharpness of these decisions, but everyone who entered understood that this was a place where futures were measured, even if no words were spoken aloud. The atmosphere carried the weight of anticipation, as if each decorative flourish existed to remind visitors of the standards they were expected to uphold. And then there was the ballroom. It wasn't immense by the standards of the palaces that would come later, yet its significance overshadowed every grander hall that followed. It could hold exactly 400 guests, not 412, not 380. 400. That number, dictated by the room's proportions rather than by whim, would become the most powerful social boundary of the era. Those invited felt the warmth of acceptance. Those excluded felt the chill of silence. The room's modest scale, in comparison to the ambitions of its time, only amplified its influence. Every inch of it was engineered to elevate some, and gently, decisively hold back others. But the most remarkable aspect of this interior was not its furniture, its frescoes, or its mirrors. It was the invisible force the rooms created together, the unspoken system by which Caroline determined who belonged. The true engine of her authority was not the architecture itself, but the capacity of this carefully orchestrated space to define a precise number, a limit that would resonate far beyond these walls. This number, soon to be whispered across dinner tables and printed in newspapers, would shape the very structure of New York society. The legendary 400 did not emerge from gossip or imagination. It was born here, inside this deliberately crafted world. The ballroom at 34th Street was never the largest in New York, nor the most extravagant, nor the most architecturally daring. Yet no other room in America ever held such disproportionate power, over the social landscape. Its influence came not from scale, but from limitation. The space could admit exactly 400 people, no more, no less, and this numerical boundary became the invisible fence that enclosed Caroline Astor's world. In a city swelling with new industrial fortunes, the ballroom's capacity was transformed into a weapon of precision, allowing Caroline to draw a line so clear, so unyielding, that it reshaped the very meaning of social acceptance. The logic behind it was disarmingly simple. If only 400 individuals could comfortably fit inside her ballroom, then only those 400 had the right to call themselves members of society's inner circle. It had nothing to do with who donated the most, who built the tallest factory, or who owned the grandest steamship line. It depended entirely on whether Caroline considered your lineage acceptable, your manners impeccable, and your connections useful, or at the very least harmless to the fragile architecture of tradition she guarded so fiercely. The room itself, with its carefully arranged mirrors, soft lighting, and interconnected drawing spaces, became the physical embodiment of the idea that exclusivity is not measured by abundance, but by restriction. Inside this hall, the power of the 400 felt tangible. The parquet floor, polished to a gentle sheen, reflected the movement of gowns and gloves in a choreography that seemed effortless, but was, in truth, the result of months of preparation. The ceiling, painted with restrained flourishes, carried the hum of conversation upward, softening it until it felt like a single voice murmuring approval. Every window, draped in fabrics chosen for effect rather than excess, framed the night outside as if the world beyond were a distant rumor. And as the orchestra lifted its first notes, guests understood something unspoken. Being in this room was a credential more valuable than wealth itself. Caroline exploited this atmospheric authority with a mastery that bordered on art. She knew that people longed for definition, for a sense of belonging in an era where fortunes rose and fell with unprecedented speed. By anchoring social legitimacy to a room designed to admit only a select few, she created a scarcity more intoxicating than any jewel or title. To be invited once was an honor, to be invited every year was a declaration, and to be excluded, especially if one believed that one deserved otherwise, was a humiliation that could echo for seasons. Newspapers eventually caught wind of the concept. Society columnists whispered about the 400, and the phrase began to appear in print as if it were an established institution, rather than the product of a room's square footage. The public, fascinated by the notion that a single building could dictate who mattered, elevated the idea into legend. The ballroom's limits crystallized into a cultural boundary that stretched far beyond Fifth Avenue. Businesses sought connections to families inside the circle. Marriages were weighed against the approval of the list implied. Politics leaned quietly upon it. Even other social hostesses found themselves forced into the orbit of Caroline's system, if only to secure their own relevance. But as the influence of this room grew, so too did the pressures surrounding it. Manhattan was changing, Fifth Avenue was shifting, and the peace that once protected Caroline's brownstone began to fracture. The arrival of heavy construction next door, the Waldorf Hotel rising under the direction of her nephew, sent tremors through not just the walls, but the delicate system of privacy and control she had built. The air filled with clatter and dust. Carriages rattled past at all hours. The steady hum of labor clashed with the quiet rituals of the social calendar. The house that had defined America's elite suddenly found itself overshadowed by steel beams, noise, and unwanted attention. The carefully maintained equilibrium could no longer survive undisturbed, and the walls that once held authority now trembled from vibrations of a modern city, pushing relentlessly forward. The ballroom remained a symbol, but the serenity that empowered it was beginning to slip away, forcing Caroline to consider a new stage on which her influence could continue. One grander, louder, and far more commanding than the genteel brownstone that had once shaped the nation's social order. What began as a controlled arena of elegance gradually turned into a battleground of noise, disruption, and unwanted rivalry. The trouble arrived not from strangers or social upstarts, but from within the Astor family itself. When Caroline's nephew, William Waldorf Astor, decided to erect a massive hotel directly beside her residence, he did more than add a new building to Fifth Avenue. he undermined the foundation of her power. The Waldorf Hotel rose with the force of a challenge, its steel skeleton climbing skyward in full view of her windows, its daily clamor filling the air that once carried only the soft sounds of carriage wheels and orchestral rehearsals. The construction site became a relentless presence. Hammers struck from dawn until dusk, sending vibrations through the brownstone walls. Dust settled on the carefully kept garden. Delivery wagons blocked the street where Caroline's guests once stepped down from polished carriages. The very ground beneath the brownstone trembled, as if reacting to the tension between two branches of a dynasty that had long cultivated an image of unity. Workers shouted directions, machinery clattered, debris fell in unpredictable bursts, each sound a reminder that Caroline's sanctuary was now bordered by a world she had tried to keep at a distance. But noise was only part of the disruption. There were politics at play, deep, uncomfortable politics rooted in pride, inheritance, and shifting influence. William Waldorf believed his side of the family deserved greater prominence and saw the hotel as a way to assert a new kind of legacy, public, commercial, undeniable. Caroline, whose authority relied on exclusivity and refinement, perceived the rising hotel as an affront, a direct intrusion on the controlled realm she cultivated. Their rivalry seeped into newspapers, dinner conversations, and the whispered remarks of those who watched the unfolding drama with fascination. Manhattan had seen industrial disputes and family quarrels before, but never one that threatened the stability of high society's most important address. As the hotel grew, so did the imbalance between the two neighboring structures. The once dignified brownstone began to look smaller, more fragile, overshadowed by the towering volume next door. Guests arriving for winter gatherings now walked past scaffolding, navigating past workmen and materials stacked against the curb. Even inside the house, fine porcelain rattled slightly on shelves. Chandeliers quivered. The quiet authority of the rooms was interrupted by the rhythmic thud of progress pressing against the walls. Caroline was not a woman who accepted intrusion lightly. She understood that a house was not merely a residence. It was a stage on which identity was performed. For decades, her home had projected control, lineage, and unspoken rules. Now, with each passing week, the house appeared more like an artifact of an earlier era, struggling to survive in a city racing toward modernity. It was no longer the unquestioned center of society's map. It was becoming an afterthought beside the grand ambition of the Waldorf Hotel. The loss of peace, the erosion of privacy, and the exhaustion brought on by decades of hosting left their mark. The brownstone that once shaped the limits of social belonging had become too exposed, too compromised. Caroline knew that remaining here, beneath the noise, beside a structure that symbolized her nephew's defiance, would diminish everything she had built. Something more decisive was required, something that would remind New York that the Astor name still carried authority, that refinement was not an outdated relic, and that her influence could not be drowned out by clanging metal and rising towers. And so, out of this forced retreat, Caroline conceived a response that would eclipse anything her nephew had imagined. A residence that would not merely match the hotel's presence, but surpass it in grandeur, symbolism, and command. This defeat did not break her. It fueled her resolve. What came next would be the most extraordinary architectural revenge of the Gilded Age, a structure designed not simply to restore her standing, but to redefine it. Caroline Astor's retreat from 34th Street was not a withdrawal. It was a recalibration. When she turned her attention uptown, she did so with a clarity sharpened by conflict. If her nephew wished to define his legacy through a hotel, then she would answer with something he could never rival, a private residence so commanding, so intricately conceived, that it would restore her place at the top of New York's social hierarchy the moment its doors opened. The site she chose at 5th Avenue and 65th Street was not selected for convenience. It was chosen for symbolism. Here, facing Central Park, she could construct a home that looked not toward the crowded blocks of commerce, but toward the open expanse of cultivated nature, a view reserved for those with enough influence to claim it. For the design, she summoned Richard Morris Hunt, the most celebrated architect of the era, a man whose work elevated mansions into cultural statements. Hunt did not suggest a townhouse or a dignified city mansion. Instead, he proposed something far more audacious, an architectural gesture that reached across the Atlantic for its inspiration. The new residence would evoke the grand château of the Loire Valley, structures associated with monarchs, noble lineages, and the kind of authority rooted not in wealth alone, but in the aura of tradition. It would be French Renaissance through an American lens, disciplined yet lavish, powerful yet refined. Stone by stone, the mansion rose like a declaration. Its facade stood tall and confident, adorned with sculpted ornaments and framed by a roofline punctuated by chimneys that towered like sentinels. Arched windows opened onto the park, allowing light to pour into interiors designed for spectacle and ceremony. A massive entrance, framed by carved pilasters and crowned with a domed vestibule, announced that visitors were stepping into a world where social order was defined, guarded, and curated with intent. Every course of limestone, every balustrade, every cornice carried the message that Caroline Astor had rebuilt her world, not out of necessity, but out of determination. The scale of the home was unprecedented. It dwarfed her former brownstone in both height and breadth, rising with a presence that demanded recognition without shouting for it. Passers-by could sense, even without knowing its occupant, that this was not simply a private home. It was architecture used as strategy. This mansion, with its theatrical grand hall and marble staircase soaring 3 stories high, was designed not just to shelter, but to proclaim. It stated, in the language of stone, that Caroline had not been pushed aside. She had relocated to a higher plane of visibility and influence. But what made this residence truly remarkable was not only the grandeur of its design, it was the fact that the mansion was not built as a single household. It was conceived as a dual structure, a pair of interlinked palatial homes that appeared from the street as one unified château. Caroline's new residence was not an isolated fortress. It was part of a larger architectural vision, a shared facade hiding 2 distinct worlds beneath one monumental roof. And this pairing, this doubling, would elevate the mansion beyond the realm of mere opulence and into the realm of legend. From the street, the mansion on 65th Street appeared to be a single architectural titan, a chateau transported from the French Renaissance and anchored onto Manhattan granite with absolute certainty. But this impression was part of the design, intentional, strategic, almost theatrical. Behind the unified facade stood 2 fully independent households, the northern residence belonging to Caroline Astor herself, and the southern one reserved for her son, John Jacob Astor IV. 2 families, 2 social calendars, 2 domestic rhythms, yet all concealed beneath one monumental exterior that presented a seamless front to the world. It was a gesture as sophisticated as any social maneuver Caroline ever executed, an architectural metaphor for dynasty, continuity, and reinforced influence. The dual structure was connected through a single, awe-inspiring entrance hall beneath a towering glass dome. Visitors arriving at the front steps passed through doors that opened into a space so luminous and expansive that it dissolved the boundary between the 2 households. Sunlight streamed through the bronze and glass canopy overhead, refracting off marble columns and polished floors in shimmering tones. The hall felt less like a domestic threshold and more like the atrium of a European palace, one where history, lineage, and order gathered beneath a single roof. The moment a guest entered, distinctions between separate wings ceased to matter. What they perceived was unity, power, and a level of refinement that placed the Astor name far above the ordinary divisions of private life. Caroline's north wing carried the traits of her temperament: quiet opulence, disciplined arrangements, and rooms created for conversation, letters, and controlled social rituals. The decor leaned toward pale tones, intricate French detailing, and textiles chosen as much for cultural symbolism as for beauty. Soft light from the park filtered through tall windows, mapping patterns across the carpets in a way that made each room feel both lived in and ceremonial. This was a space curated for reputation, where guest lists were reviewed with precision, correspondences were answered with nuance, and the subtleties of the social season were weighed as carefully as the diplomatic affairs of a small state. Meanwhile, the southern wing occupied by her son, John Jacob, reflected a different rhythm altogether. His rooms leaned into darker woods, stronger architectural lines, and a more masculine interpretation of the French Renaissance style. It contained reading rooms, smoking lounges, private studies, and spaces designed for gatherings of a distinctly different tone, political strategy meetings, discussions of investment, planning of travel, and, eventually, moments of reflection before his fateful voyage on the Titanic. His household operated on separate schedules, kept its own staff, and hosted its own guests. Yet the proximity to his mother's realm ensured that their social spheres overlapped whenever unity served the family's advantage. Despite these differences, movement between the two wings flowed easily through corridors that curved around the shared core of the mansion. Members of each household passed one another in the central hall, exchanging greetings beneath the domed ceiling that acted as the symbolic center of the complex. It was here that the Astor's dual identity, private lives, and public influence merged seamlessly into a single architectural expression. The polished marble staircase, rising in a dramatic sweep from the hall, served both wings and emphasized a message that could not be ignored. The two households were separate, but the dynasty was one. Yet even with all its rooms, its corridors, its private suites, and its carefully orchestrated domestic choreography, the most powerful space in this massive chateau was still ahead. To understand the full ambition of this architectural fortress, to grasp the true reason it towered so confidently over Fifth Avenue, one must step into the area that shaped the new era of Caroline Astor's influence, a hall whose scale and splendor surpassed anything New York had ever witnessed. The mansion's heart was not its facade, its staircase, or even its famous entrance. Its heart was the room that awaited deeper inside, the largest and most commanding ballroom of its time. The true core of the mansion on 65th Street revealed itself not in the private suites, the libraries, or the richly appointed drawing rooms, but in the space that seemed almost too grand to exist within a private residence. At the back of the interconnected Astor homes lay a ballroom so immense, so elaborate, and so confidently theatrical that it became an architectural proclamation, one that dwarfed every salon, every staircase, and every notion of domestic scale that had come before it. This was not simply a room, it was the stage on which the Astor dynasty performed its authority. 3 full stories in height, the ballroom rose like an interior cathedral to society. Its walls, lined with marble pilasters and gilded ornamentation, soared upward toward a ceiling that glowed beneath a massive dome of glass and bronze. When sunlight poured through the dome during daytime events, the entire space shimmered, as if draped in a veil of warm brilliance. In the evenings, when hundreds of candles and electric lights were reflected in mirrored panels, the hall became a world unto itself, timeless, borderless, suspended between dream and ceremony. The room could hold 1,200 guests, triple the capacity of Caroline's former ballroom, and every inch of it was engineered to orchestrate movement on a scale only grand hotels could normally accommodate. Yet this was not a public hall. It belonged to a private home. The floor, polished to a mirrored sheen, stretched from end to end like the surface of a lake, unbroken except for a wide musician's gallery where orchestras played through the night. At the far end stood 2 dramatic fountains, bronze figures of infant Neptune perched above basins into which streams of water fell with controlled elegance. The soft sound of flowing water drifted beneath the music, adding a subtle aquatic rhythm that echoed the very style of the French Renaissance architecture surrounding it. Tall French doors lined one side of the hall, opening onto terraces that faced the quiet edge of Central Park. During summer evenings, these doors allowed cool air to circulate through the ballroom, blurring the line between the indoors and the world beyond. Carved stone balconies jutted outward on the upper levels, allowing guests to look down at the spectacle below. A vision of swirling gowns, gliding dancers, and the orchestrated theater of a society that understood its own mythology. Every decorative detail served a purpose. The parquet floors, inlaid with intricate geometric patterns, carried dancers smoothly through quadrilles and waltzes. The bronze sconces shaped like sea creatures cast soft, fluctuating shadows that animated the room even when movement paused. The mirrored walls multiplied the light, giving the impression of an endless expanse of brilliance. The acoustics were tuned with such precision that the murmur of 1,200 voices never overwhelmed the orchestra, nor did the orchestra drown the soft conversations where alliances were quietly negotiated. In this hall, families ascended or faded, engagements were hinted at, partnerships were confirmed, reputations were restored or delicately rescued, and through it all, the structure itself seemed to breathe, its grandeur amplifying every gesture, every glance, every whispered observation. The ballroom was not just the centerpiece of the mansion, it was the very reason the mansion existed. Caroline had built a home, but more importantly, she had built a mechanism capable of producing stories, shaping futures, and sustaining her influence far beyond the reach of ordinary architecture. Yet, even a hall of this magnitude could not contain the full scope of the Astor presence. Their power was not confined to Manhattan's winter season. Influence had to stretch across the calendar, reaching into the warm months when New York society migrated northward in search of ocean breezes, summer rituals, and a different stage upon which to reaffirm its hierarchy. To maintain her position at the epicenter of social life, Caroline needed a residence equal in authority to her Fifth Avenue château, a place capable of commanding an entirely different arena, the seasonal world of Newport. When the summer season drew society away from Manhattan's marble halls and into the salt air of the Atlantic coast, Caroline Astor did not simply follow. She arrived with a residence designed to dominate the Newport stage as decisively as her Fifth Avenue chateau ruled the winter. Beachwood, her oceanside estate on Bellevue Avenue, stood not as a retreat, but as a continuation of influence, translated into the language of sun, sea, and summer diplomacy. With its 39 rooms spread across more than 16,000 square feet, the house embodied a kind of coastal grandeur that felt both Mediterranean and unmistakably aristocratic, as though a villa from the Italian lakes had been gently set down on Rhode Island soil. The exterior carried a quiet majesty, its symmetrical composition and broad terraces giving the impression of a structure confident in its own heritage. Tall windows opened toward the Atlantic, catching the morning light and breathing the scent of the sea into rooms decorated with an elegance that echoed the great European houses Caroline admired. Inside, the mansion unfolded in a series of salons, galleries, and intimate chambers, each space decorated to project refinement rather than novelty. The dining room, dominated by a vast marble fireplace, offered long views across the gardens and toward the shifting blue horizon. The music room, draped in Parisian wallpapers and furnished with polished wood, created a subdued elegance perfect for afternoon recitals or late evening conversations, where relationships were cultivated with the gentlest of gestures. Beachwood was not merely a place for leisure, it was a platform. Every gathering here, garden teas, charity receptions, moonlit music halls, served a function in the delicate architecture of the summer social order. Caroline used her seaside palace to reinforce alliances built during the winter season, to introduce select families into broader circles, and to observe, with the precision of a strategist, how new fortunes adapted to older expectations. Summer in Newport looked carefree to the uninitiated, but beneath its sunlight ran the same currents of influence that shaped Manhattan's winter galas. At Beachwood, these currents were softened by the sea breeze but never erased. Yet the estate's interiors did more than host polite conversations. They expressed a cosmopolitan style that reinforced Caroline's image as a woman rooted in tradition but fluent in the visual language of Europe. Imported fabrics, gilded mirrors, marble surfaces, and carefully curated artworks created an environment that felt cultivated, worldly, and undeniably authoritative. Visitors who stepped inside found themselves surrounded by a curated spectrum of tones, creams, blues, golds, designed to harmonize with the natural brightness flooding in through the French doors. The effect was serene yet stately, a balance that elevated even the smallest gathering into an event worthy of remembrance. Still, for all its rooms, corridors, and crafted elegance, Beachwood's most unforgettable space lay deeper within the estate. It was a room that crystallized the spirit of summer extravagance into a singular architectural experience, a ballroom conceived not just for dancing, but for wonder. It shimmered with mirrored panels, drifted with the glow of reflected candlelight, and carried an imaginative vision so distinct that guests spoke of it long after the season ended. This was the Oceanic Ballroom, the heart of Beachwood, a hall that made every visitor feel as though they had entered an underwater dream crafted from light, glass, and the pulse of the sea itself. Beachwood's Oceanic Ballroom was unlike anything the Gilded Age had ever seen, a space so immersive, so meticulously orchestrated, that guests stepping inside felt as if they had crossed a threshold into another element entirely. Richard Morris Hunt understood that Newport demanded spectacle of a different nature from Manhattan. Here, the Atlantic did not merely serve as a backdrop, it was the central force, the defining character of summer life. Hunt's task was to bring the ocean indoors, not by literal imitation, but by translating its sensory power into architecture, capable of stirring awe in even the most jaded members of society. The moment guests entered the ballroom, the transformation was immediate. Light fractured across more than 800 panes of glass set into mirrored walls and tall French doors, each pane reflecting a slightly different angle of sea and sky. As the sun shifted, the room flickered with subtle changes in color and tone, creating the illusion of water rippling along the surfaces. The twilight hours were the most enchanting. Warm amber hues blended with soft blue reflections from the Atlantic, making the entire space shimmer like a submerged cathedral lit from above. The floor itself played into this illusion. Hunt designed it with a reverse herringbone pattern in polished oak, arranged so precisely that the eye perceived gentle wave-like motion as dancers moved across it. Under candlelight and electric glow, the polished wood caught reflections from the mirrored walls, making guests feel as if they were gliding over a liquid surface. With each step, gowns whispered across the floor like the soft pull of tide against sand, merging bodies and architecture into a slow, mesmerizing rhythm. Brass sconces shaped like seaweed wound their way up the walls, casting elongated shadows that stretched and curled like tendrils beneath an ocean swell. Between the sconces, carved reliefs depicted mythological scenes of Poseidon, Aphrodite, and other figures of maritime lore, each rendered with a theatrical flourish that both delighted and reminded visitors of the symbolic narrative threading through the house. This was not merely decoration, it was a statement. Caroline Astor presided over a kingdom of society as naturally as ancient deities presided over the seas. The ceiling soared above in a sweep of pale blue and gold, its curved surface designed to amplify sound without drowning conversation. Orchestras stationed along the gallery could fill the room with music that shimmered as fluidly as the reflections on the walls. The acoustics struck an almost uncanny balance, clear enough to carry melodies to every corner, soft enough to allow quiet dialogue to thread seamlessly beneath them. Even the air seemed to move differently here, lifted by the breeze drifting through open French doors that connected the ballroom to terraces overlooking the water. The Oceanic Ballroom was the ultimate performance space, not just for dancers or musicians, but for the social hierarchy itself. Here, people did not simply attend events. They participated in a spectacle that reaffirmed their positions, roles, and alliances. The room's design amplified the drama of the season. Entrances became symbolic, glances carried weight, and the gentle glow of reflected light made every gesture appear intentional, even when it wasn't. The space was a kind of social amplifier, magnifying charisma, reputation, and presence. For the Astors, this room was not an indulgence. It was a strategic environment. Hosting an event here was an assertion of dominance, a reminder that Caroline's influence extended seamlessly from the winter ballrooms of Manhattan to the summer shores of Newport. Every inch of the hall proclaimed continuity, authority, and the permanence of a family whose name shaped the script of American high society. Yet, even with all its splendor, even with its ability to enchant and overwhelm, Beachwood was only one axis of the Astors' reach. Their authority did not end at the Atlantic's edge or vanish when autumn breezes swept across the terraces. Beyond Newport, far from the noise of Fifth Avenue and the sparkle of summer galas, lay another kind of power, quiet, vast, and rooted not in gatherings, but in land itself. The Astor legacy stretched into the Hudson Valley, where fields, forests, and sprawling estates revealed a deeper, older dimension of influence, a domain built not on performance, but on ownership. Far from the chandeliers of Manhattan and the salt-washed terraces of Newport, the Astor world expanded into something quieter, larger, and, in many ways, more revealing. In the rolling landscape of the Hudson River Valley lay Ferncliffe, a property so vast that it seemed less an estate and more a self-contained principality. Here, the Astor influence was not exercised through salons or ballrooms, but through land, management, and the quiet authority of ownership. Ferncliffe stretched across 2,800 acres of meadows, forests, winding roads, and cultivated fields, forming a domain that spoke to a different kind of power, not performative, but deeply rooted. The main house, originally built in 1874, stood with the calm solidity of a residence designed for permanence rather than display. Unlike the theatrical French château on Fifth Avenue or the shimmering Italian villa in Newport, Ferncliffe's architecture favored restraint. Its brick and stone exterior, softened by ivy and set against the expansive greenery, projected dignity without the need for gilded ornament. Wide verandas wrapped the home, offering shaded views of the river and the estate below, where hills rose and fell in gentle curves. Tall, narrow windows looked out over fields that changed character with every season. Lush in summer, gold in autumn, silvered and quiet in winter. Inside, the rooms were designed less for spectacle and more for endurance. The great hall featured heavy timber beams and a hearth large enough to warm groups returning from long rides or chilly walks along the wooded paths. Bedrooms and sitting rooms were lined with sturdy wood paneling, their proportions generous but never extravagant. This was a house built for long stays, early mornings and late evenings, its elegance emerging not from ornament, but from craftsmanship. The furniture was practical, the fabrics durable, the layout intentionally adapted to the rhythms of rural life. Here, conversations drifted not about invitations or seating charts, but about crops, harvests, horses, and the coordination of hundreds of acres that needed constant attention. Surrounding the house were the working structures that revealed Ferncliffe's true nature. A series of barns stretched across the estate, dairy barns with ventilated cupolas, poultry houses lined with rows of wooden nesting boxes, and stables large enough to accommodate the finest horses William Backhouse Astor Jr. ever owned. The scent of hay and earth mixed with the brisk air blowing in from the river. Fields were divided into sections for grain, pasture, and fodder production, each tended by teams of workers who maintained the estate year-round. During the early 20th century, the estate's stables held some of the prized horses in the region, overseen by trainers who managed breeding, racing, and general upkeep with a precision that made Ferncliffe one of the Hudson Valley's most respected equestrian centers. But the property extended far beyond simple agriculture. Hidden within the acreage were greenhouses crafted from imported English glass, their iron frames sheltering citrus trees, exotic plants, and winter vegetables. A tea house sat perched on a rise overlooking the river, where the family could retreat for quiet afternoons or informal gatherings. A gatehouse, an elegant building in its own right, marked the formal entrance to the estate along Ferncliffe Road, its stone pillars standing like watchful guardians. Staff cottages dotted the property at measured intervals, housing the dozens of workers needed to maintain the vast terrain. Trails and carriage drives snaked through the woods, allowing guests to travel effortlessly from one corner of the estate to another, passing fields where cattle grazed or worker teams tended seasonal tasks. Ferncliffe was not a showpiece. It was an operational world, one that required discipline, planning, and a deep understanding of the land. While Caroline's urban and seaside residences served as stages for society, Ferncliffe revealed the foundation beneath the Astor legend, the kind of wealth sustained not merely by reputation, but by stewardship. The estate was a living organism, expanding and contracting with the seasons, its needs dictating the calendar far more sternly than any social obligation ever could. Yet, as grand as the manor was, and as impressive as its agricultural reach extended, Ferncliffe was only one part of a much larger composition. Managing an estate of this magnitude required not just buildings and fields, but a network of roads, power sources, transportation systems, and structures dedicated to leisure, athleticism, and hospitality. The Astor Empire was not complete without these layers of infrastructure. innovations that turned Ferncliffe from a rural refuge into a self-sufficient domain capable of hosting guests, sustaining production, and demonstrating a kind of luxury that operated behind the scenes rather than in front of crowds. Ferncliffe's landscape unfolded like a tapestry, but its most astonishing feature was not the main residence, the barns, the orchards, or even the sweeping views across the Hudson. Hidden deeper within the estate stood a structure so extraordinary, so ahead of its time, that it blurred the line between private home and private civilization. This was the Sports Pavilion designed by Stanford White, a visionary creation that transformed Ferncliffe from a traditional country estate into something resembling a small, autonomous world. White, already renowned for his mastery of grandeur and proportion, was given a clear directive: create a building that would elevate recreation to the level of ceremony. What he delivered was nothing short of revolutionary. The pavilion stretched across some 40,000 square feet, an astonishing footprint for any era, and especially remarkable for a privately owned structure in the early 20th century. From the outside, it resembled an elegant adaptation of the Grand Trianon at Versailles, with its arched windows, classical pilasters, and marble details that hinted at European aristocratic leisure. But once a visitor stepped inside, the true marvel of the building revealed itself. The centerpiece was one of America's earliest indoor swimming pools, a long, echoing expanse of turquoise water, illuminated by skylights overhead. The air inside was warm, buoyant, and faintly scented with the mineral clarity of treated pool water. Columns lined the edges of the room, framing the pool as if it were the central feature of a private bathhouse designed for a family that considered relaxation a refined obligation. On winter days, when snow blanketed the fields outside, the pool glowed like a summer oasis sealed behind glass and tile. Beyond the pool lay a full-sized indoor tennis court, its polished wood floor stretching beneath a cavernous ceiling where sound traveled sharply, amplifying each thwack of a racket and every rapid footstep. Spectators could watch from a raised gallery that wrapped the perimeter, allowing guests to observe matches without interfering with play. The lighting was engineered with remarkable care, avoiding glare while ensuring the court remained brightly illuminated, regardless of the weather outside. This court alone would have been an innovation, yet it was merely one component of the pavilion's athletic domain. Adjoining rooms held a squash court, its walls absorbing the crisp rebound of rubber balls, and a two-lane bowling alley with hardwood lanes polished to a luminous sheen. The bowling alley, humming with mechanical pin setters, offered a pastime that blended American comfort with Astor-level luxury. Thick curtains could be drawn to reduce noise, creating private spaces for games long after the sun had set. A billiard room, richly paneled and fitted with tables imported from England, provided another layer of entertainment. Lounges furnished with deep leather chairs, carved mantels, and open fireplaces offered places for rest between matches, conversations, or simple observation. Together, these amenities created a facility far beyond the concept of leisure. The pavilion operated as the recreational heart of Ferncliffe, a place where the family and their guests could remain active throughout the year without relying on public clubs or seasonal weather. In an era before widespread indoor athletic centers, Ferncliffe boasted something astonishing: a private universe where exercise, entertainment, health, and hospitality converged under a single roof. But White's genius rested not only in the architecture itself, but in the way he integrated modernity with tradition. The pavilion was heated with an advanced system that kept the pool warm in winter, ventilated with a network of ducts that maintained airflow across the courts, and lit with a combination of skylights and electric fixtures that blended seamlessly with classical ornament. It was self-contained, technologically sophisticated, and functionally independent, reflecting the early 20th century dream that a great household could operate like a miniature city. Visitors often remarked that Ferncliffe felt less like an estate and more like a realm unto itself, a place where luxury coexisted with practicality and where every activity, from swimming to bowling to winter tennis, was made possible without ever leaving the property. The Astors had effectively created a world where the boundaries between public and private dissolved, replaced by a complete internal ecosystem designed for pleasure, discipline, and display. And yet, Even with all its grandeur, its innovations, its architectural daring, and its careful orchestration of every detail, Ferncliffe could not escape a reality that faced all mammoth estates of the Gilded Age. The forces of the 20th century, economic shifts, changing attitudes toward labor, the decline of massive households, were rising with a momentum no architect could deflect. The pavilion, the house, the barns, the fields, all were part of a model of life that could not withstand the transformations ahead. The estate was a masterpiece of its era, but even masterpieces must contend with time, and time was beginning to reshape the world around Ferncliffe, quietly but unavoidably, just as it had once displaced the brownstone on 34th Street and the early salons of Manhattan. The unraveling of the Astor estate system did not come with a single dramatic blow, no moment of sudden collapse or visible fracture. Instead, it advanced with the quiet persistence of changing times, slow at first, almost imperceptible, then accelerating with a force that even the wealthiest families could not counter. Ferncliffe, like the grand mansions of Fifth Avenue and the shimmering halls of Newport, began to feel the pressure of a nation stepping into a new era. The industrial might that had once built these estates now returned in a different form: mechanization, taxation, and shifting social expectations that rendered the old world increasingly unsustainable. The first and perhaps most crippling pressure came from escalating land taxes. In the late 19th century, municipalities had welcomed estates like Ferncliffe as symbols of prosperity, imposing modest levies to encourage families of means to build, maintain, and expand. But as the 20th century progressed, cities and counties recognized the enormous value of these properties, not as monuments to lineage, but as taxable capital. The acres that once stretched freely along the Hudson were reassessed with numbers that reflected their potential for subdivision, not their historical role as a unified estate. What had once cost hundreds a year soon required thousands, and eventually tens of thousands. Large landholdings became financial burdens rather than badges of prestige. Every acre of meadow, every woodland trail, every stretch of shoreline quietly added weight to a ledger already growing too heavy to balance. At the same time, the very workforce that made these households possible was disappearing. Domestic service, once a cornerstone of upper-class life, was in rapid decline. Factories, clerical offices, and new urban industries offered wages and independence that household service could not compete with. Young men and women who might once have staffed the Astor homes now sought opportunities where days were predictable, evenings were their own, and advancement was measured by skill rather than the whims of employers. Running an estate like Ferncliffe required dozens of workers: gardeners, stable hands, cooks, maids, chauffeurs, laundresses, groundskeepers, and managers to coordinate them all. As wages rose and availability shrank, entire wings of the estate were shuttered during the off-season. Fields that once thrived under careful cultivation grew wild at the edges. Repairs were postponed. Rooms went unused, covered in white sheets each winter with no guarantee they would reopen again. Economic storms hit hard as well. The Panic of 1907, the contractions of the 1910s, and the upheavals surrounding the First World War all strained even affluent families. But it was the Great Depression that delivered the most decisive blow. Investment portfolios crumbled, trust diminished. Businesses that had once seemed immovable suddenly required intervention or liquidation. Maintaining estates of enormous size no longer signaled honor. It signaled impracticality. Families across the Northeast began making the same difficult decision: sell the land, reduce the property, close the estate, or let it decay. Some parcels at Ferncliffe were quietly sold off, sliced from the original acreage like slivers of a once monumental whole. Houses that had hosted diplomats and magnates now stood dark through the winter, their upkeep reduced to the bare essentials. Even the architectural jewels were not immune. Ornate fireplaces were removed and sold to collectors. Chandeliers that once lit soirees were auctioned off in discreet sales. Greenhouses were dismantled or left to collapse under snow. The sports pavilion, still magnificent in its bones, saw its rooms repurposed, then neglected, then altered again as new generations struggled to maintain structures built for a lifestyle that no longer existed. Ferncliffe was not alone in this quiet fading. Across New York, Rhode Island, and Massachusetts, estates dissolved into smaller properties, repurposed buildings, or vanished foundations marked only by old stone walls or forgotten roadbeds. Mechanization contributed another deep cut. Tractors, automobiles, commercial dairy plants, and centralized distribution all reduced the need for private agricultural estates. What had once been a sign of noble responsibility, managing land and livestock, became a costly attachment to an outdated way of life. Large estates could no longer justify the labor or expense required to maintain farms that produced less efficiently than modern industrial operations. Land that once fed households and staff was either leased away, abandoned to time, or converted into separate residential parcels. Yet the decline was not simply financial or logistical. Society itself was changing. The rituals of the Gilded Age, balls, seasons, carefully curated guest lists, lost their cultural dominance. New forms of entertainment, new social values, and a newfound emphasis on individuality replaced the rigid hierarchies that had once given purpose to these great houses. The world no longer revolved around who attended which ball or who summered in which mansion. The grip of families like the Astors loosened, not through scandal or downfall, but through obsolescence. One by one, these enormous homes met their fates. Demolition crews arrived in Manhattan. Newport estates were sold, repurposed, or left to weather. Farmhouses and pavilions in the Hudson Valley surrendered to nature or developers. The empire of houses that once defined an era began dissolving into memory, its remnants scattered through archives, museums, private collections, and the recollections of aging descendants. But even as so many of these grand structures faded away, not all of them vanished without leaving traces. Some elements survived, carved stone here, a salvaged panel there, a portion of land preserved by historical societies or transformed into public spaces. The story of the Astor homes did not end in disappearance alone. Portions of their legacy endured, waiting to be rediscovered in fragments, photographs, and restored spaces that offered a glimpse into a world both lost and lingering. In the decades that followed the decline of the great Astor estates, their physical presence across America began to fragment into an intricate mosaic of ruins, restorations, and reinventions. Walking through the locations where these mansions once stood is like moving through a landscape shaped by memory rather than architecture. Each site carries an echo of the past, but rarely the structure itself. Many of these houses, once the pillars of society, have been erased entirely, leaving behind nothing more than a street address or a faint outline in old maps. Others have been transformed beyond recognition, absorbed into institutions or reimagined by new owners whose visions diverged sharply from the Gilded Age's disciplined grandeur. The original Astor brownstone on 34th Street, once the epicenter of America's winter season, no longer stands. Its demolition paved the way for the Astoria Hotel, an architectural and familial counterstroke constructed by Caroline's nephew. When the Waldorf in Astoria merged into the Waldorf-Astoria complex, the site shifted from private ritual to public grandeur. Today, the location is occupied by the lower levels of the Empire State Building, an ironic turn that replaced the carefully guarded exclusivity of Caroline's parlor with one of the most visited buildings in the world. The address remains iconic, but the house that shaped the 400 exists now only in photographs and architectural sketches filed in library collections. The 65th Street Château, Caroline's towering architectural rebuke to the intrusion of the Waldorf, also met a fate that betrayed its original purpose. After her passing, and before John Jacob IV's departure on the Titanic, the mansion underwent a partial unification, as the partition between mother and son's residences was removed. Yet even that transformation could not save it. In the 1920s, despite its grandeur, the house was demolished to make way for Temple Emmanuel, one of the most prominent synagogues in New York City. The spiritual presence that now occupies the site carries a different form of reverence, replacing gilded ballrooms with sacred quiet. Only a few architectural fragments remain scattered across private collections, museum vaults, or embedded subtly into later renovations. Newport's Beachwood had a more winding journey. For decades after Caroline's era, it survived as a museum, complete with actors reenacting the daily life of its staff and residents. Visitors walked through rooms restored to their Gilded Age appearance, imagining the glow of oceanic light flickering across mirrored surfaces. But the estate changed hands numerous times, and each transition altered the interior slightly. When billionaire Larry Ellison purchased the property in 2010, he embarked on an extensive restoration intended to return Beachwood to its 1881 splendor. Artisans replicated Hunt's designs with painstaking fidelity, reconstructing lost architectural elements and repairing features damaged by storms and time. Beachwood today stands as both a historical recreation and a private museum, housing Ellison's collection of European art. In its revived form, the house speaks not only of Gilded Age Newport, but also of modern wealth's fascination with resurrecting the past. Ferncliffe, meanwhile, dissolved slowly. The original mansion was demolished in the mid-20th century after successive generations reduced their presence on the estate. The land, too vast and too expensive to maintain intact, was divided and repurposed. Portions became public nature preserves, protected under agreements that ensured their landscapes would remain untouched by development. Other segments were converted into private homes, nursing facilities, or community spaces. The Sports Pavilion, White's architectural marvel, survived for decades, though significantly altered before being purchased and restored by new owners committed to preserving what remained. These fragments of Ferncliffe lie scattered along the Hudson Valley like pages torn from a once massive ledger. In some cases, salvaged elements of the Astor homes resurfaced in unexpected places. Marble fireplace surrounds appeared in suburban living rooms, antique shops, or discreetly wealthy households. Carved wood panels migrated into townhouses renovated in the 1950s and 60s, their origins forgotten or reduced to rumor. Leaded windows, chandeliers, and ironwork, sold quietly during the years of economic strain, found new life far from their original walls. Visiting certain historic homes in New York or New England, one might occasionally encounter a piece of carved stone or decorative molding whose provenance traces back, however faintly, to the vanished Astor estates. Yet perhaps the most enduring remnants are the archives, the photographs, correspondence, architectural drawings, and society columns that document the Astor imprint with a clarity the buildings no longer provide. University libraries preserve blueprints. Local historical societies maintain scrapbooks, diaries, and guest books. Museums curate surviving furniture and artworks. Through these collections, the vanished rooms can be reconstructed not physically, but intellectually, allowing historians and enthusiasts to trace the lines of influence that radiated from each address. But the significance of these houses reaches beyond their architectural achievements. Their disappearance does not diminish the role they played in shaping cultural expectations, social structures, and the rhythms of American life during the Gilded Age. Their meaning lies not only in stone and marble, but in the behaviors, aspirations, and hierarchies they cultivated. And to fully understand the legacy of Caroline Astor and her family, one must look not only at what has been lost in the physical world, but at the lasting impact these homes had on the values and identities of the society they once ruled. Even in their absence, the Astor houses continue to cast long shadows across American life. Their stones may be gone, their ballrooms silent, their terraces surrendered to new foundations or open sky, but the patterns they established, the rhythms of status, taste, and urban identity, remain woven into the cultural fabric of the country. To understand why these lost mansions still matter, one must look beyond architecture and see the deeper currents they set in motion. These houses were not merely luxurious shelters. They were instruments of social engineering, laboratories where the concepts of exclusivity, refinement, and hierarchy were forged, polished, and projected onto the nation at large. The Astor residences gave shape to ideas that outlived their walls. Their salons defined the etiquette of the elite, teaching generations how to navigate invitations, alliances, and appearances. Their ballrooms established the notion that space itself could determine belonging, that a single room, by limiting access, could assign value to human relationships. Their facades demonstrated how architecture could function as a public statement, a visual vocabulary through which families crafted myths about themselves. And their gardens, terraces, and seaside halls showed how nature could be framed, edited, and transformed into a setting for influence. These were not isolated gestures. They became templates for later generations, informing everything from the design of luxury hotels to the layout of modern social clubs. Cities, too, still reflect the Astor imprint. Fifth Avenue's ascent as a symbol of wealth began with families like the Astors, who invested in grandeur not as an indulgence, but as a strategy. Newport's identity as a summer capital of American aristocracy was reinforced by estates like Beachwood, whose scale and elegance drew others to build along its avenue. Even the Hudson Valley's patchwork of estates, parks, and preserved landscapes owes part of its legacy to the vast footprint of Ferncliffe and similar properties. The interplay between private ambition and public space, between personal power and urban development, was shaped in part by the decisions these families made about where and how to build. Yet their disappearance tells an equally important story. The destruction of the 34th Street brownstone, the demolition of the 65th Street château, the fragmentation of Ferncliffe, and the shifting fate of Beachwood are reminders that grandeur is often vulnerable to forces far larger than individual ambition. Economic upheaval, demographic changes, shifting cultural values, and the relentless advance of technology all had roles in dissolving the world the Astors once ruled. Their vanished homes serve as cautionary tales about the fragility of influence built on physical splendor alone. No amount of marble, craftsmanship, or social prestige could protect these structures from obsolescence. Their fall mirrors the broader transformation of America from a society governed by rigid hierarchies to one defined by fluidity and reinvention. Still, the story does not end in loss. What endures, beyond photographs, beyond restored fragments, beyond archives, is the understanding that architecture can shape identity as profoundly as laws or art. The Astor houses remind us that the built environment is never neutral. It can elevate, exclude, inspire, or intimidate. It can reflect values or impose them. When such houses vanish, they leave behind questions about what we choose to preserve, why we preserve it, and what it means when we allow certain histories to fade while others endure. And so, even in ruins or in memory, these estates continue to rule in their own way, not through grandeur, but through the lessons they offer. They teach us that elegance can be strategic, that influence often hides in the spaces where people gather, and that entire eras can be read in the outlines of vanished foundations. Their ghosts remain active participants in the American story, whispering reminders that cultural power can be both immense and fleeting. As we move toward the next chapter in this series, exploring the forgotten mansions, the hidden estates, and the overlooked dynasties that shape the nation, the Astor houses stand as both origin and warning. They invite us to look deeper, not just at what was built, but at what these structures meant to the people who lived within them, and to the society that orbited around their walls. Their physical forms may be gone, but their influence remains, guiding us toward the next vanished landmark waiting to be uncovered.